Khalil Walker had seen his fair share of schools, each one with its own set of challenges. As the son of a military officer, he had learned to adapt quickly, but Ridgewood High was different. It wasn't just that he was the new kid, he was the new black kid in a school where diversity wasn't exactly celebrated. He had expected the stares, the whispers, but he wasn't prepared for what was to come. On his first day, he walked into the cafeteria, holding his tray of food, and immediately felt the weight of every eye in the room. The students who were once engaged in their conversations now paused, their eyes following him as he moved. Khalil tried not to notice, but it was hard to ignore the way people seemed to assess him the moment he stepped into the space. He wasn't someone who would immediately stand out, but today he was the center of attention, and it wasn't a good thing. At the far end of the cafeteria, Jason, the school's notorious bully and leader of the popular crowd, looked over at Khalil. The smug smile on his face didn't go unnoticed. Jason had a reputation of making life difficult for anyone who didn't fit into his narrow view of the world, and he had decided that Khalil would be his next target. Khalil picked a table by the window, trying to mind his business. He didn't want trouble, but he also wasn't about to hide in the corner. As he set down his tray and started eating, he could feel Jason's gaze burning into him. Khalil had learned to handle bullies, but something about this particular group felt different. They were unpredictable, and Jason had always been known for pushing the limits when it came to his cruelty. The boys surrounding Jason whispered among themselves, casting curious glances at Khalil, and then one of them, Matt, whispered something to Jason. Jason chuckled, clearly coming up with a plan. Khalil sighed quietly to himself. He had been in this position before. He knew the game. He had faced worse in other schools, but for some reason, Ridgewood felt more hostile. Jason, never one to waste an opportunity, walked over to Khalil with a smirk plastered on his face. He stopped just short of Khalil's table, blocking the light from the window. "Hey, new guy," Jason said loudly, his voice carrying across the room. "You lost or just trying to blend in?" Khalil looked up, meeting his eyes. He could feel the tension in the air, but he wasn't going to show fear. "I'm just eating my lunch, Jason," Khalil replied calmly. He didn't need to escalate things, but he also wasn't going to let Jason think he could push him around. Jason's grin widened. "I don't think you belong here, man. This isn't a place for people like you." The words were deliberately cruel, meant to provoke, and the whole cafeteria seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Khalil to react. Khalil clenched his jaw. He knew what Jason was trying to do, but he wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Khalil said, his voice steady. Jason took a step forward, lowering his voice. "You really think you can just walk in here and be one of us? You don't belong." He was testing Khalil, waiting to see if he would break, but Khalil wasn't the type to back down. He didn't flinch or raise his voice. He simply looked Jason in the eyes, unblinking. "If you have something to say, say it. But don't waste my time." Jason's face twisted in frustration. He had expected Khalil to back off, to feel small under his glare, but that wasn't happening. Jason was used to control, to intimidation, and for the first time he realized that he wasn't getting it with Khalil. Khalil had made his point, and though the tension still hung in the air, he turned back to his lunch, uninterested in engaging further. The words of the bully no longer had power over him, and for the first time at Ridgewood, he felt like he had just taken the first step in not just surviving, but thriving. Jason was fuming. His reputation as the alpha male of Ridgewood was based on his ability to dominate, to control those around him. Khalil, the new kid, had completely ignored him, not even flinching at his insults. That was something Jason couldn't let slide. He couldn't stand the idea of someone thinking they could come into his territory and show him up. The following day, Jason and his friends, Matt and Ryan, watched Khalil closely from across the cafeteria. They had been planning their next move, and this time they wouldn't be subtle. Jason had a plan to make Khalil feel what it meant to be an outsider, and he wasn't going to let this go so easily. "Watch this," Jason whispered to Matt, his eyes narrowing as he saw Khalil sitting by himself again. This was the perfect moment to take action. Without hesitation, Jason stood up and made his way toward Khalil. Matt and Ryan followed closely behind, a sense of anticipation building in the air. They had been plotting their next move for days, and now it was time to act. Jason wasn't going to let Khalil think he could just come into this school and be left alone. Jason walked up to Khalil's table with his usual arrogant swagger. He stood over Khalil, blocking the sunlight again. "You're still here, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I thought I told you this place isn't for you." Khalil looked up, his expression calm but firm. He wasn't surprised. He knew this moment was coming. "I'm not bothering anyone, but you seem to be." Jason smirked, leaning over the table. "I think it's time someone teaches you what happens when you try to be something you're not." With that, he grabbed Khalil's lunch tray and tossed it to the floor, spilling the contents across the room. The cafeteria fell silent, everyone watching the scene unfold. But Khalil didn't react the way Jason had expected. Instead of retreating, instead of showing fear, Khalil stood up, his eyes cold with resolve. He wiped his hands on his pants and faced Jason. "You've made your point," Khalil said quietly, his voice gaining strength. "But now it's my turn." And with that, Khalil moved faster than Jason could anticipate, sending him stumbling backward, his confidence completely shattered. The cafeteria remained dead silent as Jason stumbled backward, his hands instinctively trying to stabilize himself. He had never expected Khalil to fight back. His brain struggled to process what had just happened. The smooth, swift movements of Khalil, who had been quiet and calm just moments before. Khalil's swift action caught Jason off guard. It wasn't just that he had knocked him off balance. It was the fact that Jason, who had ruled the school with his arrogance and bullying for years, was now vulnerable in front of the entire cafeteria. His ego had been shattered, and the weight of that realization hit him harder than the push from Khalil. Jason glared at Khalil, disbelief clouding his face. The cafeteria, still in stunned silence, was waiting for the next move. Khalil didn't let the silence hang for too long. "Keep pushing me, Jason," Khalil said, his voice low and controlled. "But remember, I won't back down." Jason hesitated for a moment, trying to regain his composure, but it was clear that Khalil wasn't the easy target he had assumed. He wasn't just another kid who would back off when the pressure was on. Khalil wasn't intimidated by his size, his friends, or his reputation. Jason's arrogance had led him to believe that bullying others was a simple game, one that he could always win. But Khalil had just shown him that the rules had changed. Before Jason could come up with a snappy retort, Matt and Ryan stepped forward, eager to defend their friend. Ryan, looking more confused than anything, called out, "Jason, come on! What's going on? We're just having a little fun here." Jason shot him a harsh glare as though he were embarrassed by the weak excuse. But Ryan's words seemed to momentarily break the tension in the air, and for a second, Jason seemed to reconsider his actions. But the damage had already been done. The other students in the cafeteria were no longer just passive observers. They were witnesses to something unexpected. Jason, the school's top bully, was the one who was now standing back, his pride in tatters. Khalil's calm presence in the face of adversity was what struck the most. He didn't lash out. He didn't shout. Instead, he remained calm, focused, and unbothered by the group of boys who thought they could intimidate him. It was as though he had stepped into a new level of confidence, and Jason realized, too late, that the power dynamics were shifting. "Take your joke somewhere else," Khalil said, his words calm but his demeanor unyielding. Jason's face reddened in anger, but there was an underlying recognition that he had made a mistake. His usual tricks weren't working, and he knew it. There was no winning this round for him. After a few more moments of tense silence, Jason's friends, Matt and Ryan, seemed to exchange uncertain glances. Their bravado had disappeared, and the once formidable trio of bullies stood awkwardly in front of Khalil, who was still standing strong, unwavering. Without another word, Jason turned and walked away. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Matt and Ryan followed behind, both looking unsure of what had just transpired. The energy in the cafeteria shifted, and people began murmuring amongst themselves. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a new kind of strength, the kind that didn't need to be loud or violent. It simply stood its ground. Khalil didn't watch them leave. He simply returned to his lunch, picking up the spilled contents and sitting down again as though nothing had happened. His calmness was unshaken, his presence undeniable. Tyrell, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, approached him slowly, a smile creeping onto his face. "Man, you just took him down without even breaking a sweat." Khalil smiled back, his eyes unwavering. Sometimes the best response is silence. Actions speak louder than words. The days following the cafeteria incident were a defining moment for both Khalil and the Ridgewood High student body. What had started as a routine school day with the usual cafeteria chatter had quickly turned into a spectacle, one that left an impression on everyone who had witnessed it. The students who had once dismissed Khalil as the quiet new kid now saw him in a new light. He wasn't just the outsider. He was someone who had stood his ground and earned his respect, not through force or noise, but through calm, controlled strength. The day after the incident, the atmosphere in the school was different. There was a subtle shift in how people interacted with Khalil. When he walked through the halls, the students who would have normally ignored him now made eye contact, nodding in acknowledgement. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to make Khalil realize that something had changed. It wasn't the applause or the cheers that followed his actions. It was the quiet recognition of his inner strength. People no longer saw him as an easy target. They saw him as someone who couldn't be pushed around. Jason, Matt, and Ryan, on the other hand, were noticeably absent from their usual spots. Jason, in particular, seemed to shrink away from the group, no longer exuding the same air of dominance he once did. His usual arrogance was replaced by a reluctant humility, something Khalil had never expected to see. Jason was a bully, always surrounded by his group, and he had thrived on making others feel inferior. But after his humiliating defeat, he was left alone, isolated in the wake of his own actions. He no longer had the power to intimidate anyone. At lunch that day, Khalil was sitting with Tyrell, feeling the usual calm that came with his own company. Tyrell, noticing the shift, leaned in with a grin. "Man, I have to admit, you've got some serious moves, not just in the fight, but in the way you handled the whole situation." Khalil smiled, but there was no smugness in his expression. He wasn't interested in basking in the victory. It wasn't about the fight. I had to make a point, not just to Jason, but to myself. I'm not going to let anyone push me around anymore. I've been silent for too long. Tyrell nodded. "I get it. You didn't just knock him down physically. You knocked him down a peg in front of everyone. He can't act the same anymore, not after that." Khalil's thoughts turned back to Jason. He had no desire for revenge, but something about the bully's shift in behavior made him reflect. It wasn't just about the physical confrontation. It was about how Jason and his friends had underestimated him, how they thought they could break him down. Jason had used bullying as a way to keep control over others, but Khalil had shown him that it didn't have to work that way. Later that week, something unexpected happened. Jason, who had always been the center of attention, who had never been challenged in his own domain, was seen sitting alone in the cafeteria. His friends, Matt and Ryan, were nowhere to be found. He seemed lost, like a shadow of his former self. The students who had once feared him or admired his bravado now looked past him, their attention focused on other things, other people. Khalil wasn't one to gloat. He didn't approach Jason or point out his solitude. Instead, he simply kept to himself, knowing that Jason had gotten what he deserved. The bully had tried to break him down, to humiliate him, and yet it was Khalil who had stood tall. He had proven that strength wasn't about being loud or dominating others. It was about standing firm when life challenged you. Over the next few days, Khalil began to notice a change in the general atmosphere of the school. Jason's former supporters had begun to turn their attention elsewhere. The confidence that had once radiated from him was gone, replaced by the quiet realization that bullying others didn't make him powerful. In fact, it only made him weak. His reputation had been shattered, and the silence that followed was the most powerful consequence of all. As Khalil sat at lunch with Terrell the following week, he glanced around the cafeteria. He could see the way people were starting to view him differently, not with fear, but with respect. They didn't see the quiet new kid anymore. They saw someone who had fought back, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, had earned the respect of his peers. Jason's time in the spotlight had passed, but Khalil's journey had only just begun. He wasn't just surviving Ridgewood High anymore. He was thriving. He wasn't going to let anyone define him. He had proven to himself and everyone around him that he was strong, not because of the physical fight he had won, but because of the strength of character that had carried him through. And as Khalil walked through the hallways, his head held high. He knew that the school wasn't just going to see him as a new kid anymore. They would see him as someone who would not be silenced. He had earned his place not just in the school, but in the hearts of those who now understood what true strength looked like. As the days passed, the aftermath of the cafeteria incident became a turning point, not only for Jason but for the entire school. The dynamics had shifted. The bullying that Khalil had endured for years seemed like a distant memory, replaced with something new. Respect. It wasn't just about Jason, it was about the ripple effect Khalil had created. Students who had once whispered behind his back now offered nods of approval when he walked by. He wasn't just the quiet new kid anymore. He was someone who had stood up, not with anger, but with dignity. And it hadn't gone unnoticed. Jason, once the king of his social circle, had become a shadow of his former self. He wasn't the one people looked up to anymore. No one feared him or hung on his every word. Instead, students started looking up to Khalil. They respected him for standing up for himself and for showing them that strength wasn't about being the loudest person in the room, but about standing tall when the world tried to push you down. Jason's humiliation had caused him to retreat. He stopped walking with his usual swagger, no longer drawing attention to himself. He tried to fit in again, but the power he once wielded over others was gone. In its place was something far less tangible. He had lost his grip on his own reputation. Khalil, on the other hand, continued his quiet journey towards self-discovery. He didn't want to be the center of attention, but he knew that he had earned the respect of his peers. He had fought not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked or pushed aside. He had fought for the right to be seen as more than just a label. He didn't have to fight any more battles after that day. The way people treated him had changed. The whispers had stopped. There was no more mockery or condescension. Instead, Khalil found himself becoming a quiet leader, someone others turned to for guidance. And it wasn't because he was loud or demanding, but because he had earned their respect through his actions, through his calmness in the face of adversity. The relationship between Khalil and Tyrell had also evolved. Tyrell had always had his back, but now they both understood the deeper meaning behind Khalil's actions. Tyrell respected Khalil not just for his fighting abilities, but for his wisdom. He saw the change in Khalil, the way he no longer shrank from challenges, and the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. Tyrell admired him for it, and their friendship grew stronger because of it. One day, as they sat together in the courtyard, Tyrell looked at Khalil with a grin. "You know, man, you've really changed things here. People actually respect you now." Khalil looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I didn't do it for them. I did it for me. I needed to show myself that I could stand up, that I could fight, not with my fists, but with my mind. And if others see that, then that's just a bonus." Tyrell nodded, understanding completely. He had always known there was more to Khalil than met the eye, and now everyone else saw it too. Khalil stood up and brushed the dirt off his pants, looking toward the horizon. "I'm ready for whatever comes next. I'm not running away anymore. I've got my own back." And with that, Khalil continued walking through the hallways of Ridgewood High with his head held high. He wasn't just the new kid anymore. He was someone who had proven himself, who had fought for his right to be seen, and who had earned the respect of his peers. The journey wasn't over, but it was just beginning. In the end, Khalil had learned that strength wasn't measured by the battles you fought, but by the way you carried yourself through them. He had stood tall when the world tried to knock him down, and in doing so, he had become the person he was always meant to be, a leader, a fighter, and someone who would not be ignored.